Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. In today's video, we're looking at Nikon's Z6 III, one of their new hybrid cameras. We're going to give you the pros and cons on this one, and I'm also going to tell you who this one is for right after this. Now in today's video, I'm looking at Nikon's Z6 III. I've had this one, tested it for well over a month now. I want to thank my partners at B&H for loaning this to me. It's been a pleasure to have it for an extended period of time and really get my hands on it. The nice thing about getting loan cameras or any loan equipment is that I have no affiliation to the companies involved, and I can just give you an honest review and honest feedback about it. And in this case, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of this camera body, and I'm also going to tell you who this one is for. Now, this is going to be an abbreviated video. I've got some in-depth videos, so check out my playlist around Nikon and the Z6 III for a lot of other videos that are going to get into some more details. But in this video, a quick recap of what I liked and what I didn't like about it. And we're going to start with just the overall build. Now for the overall build, I really like the ergonomics of this. The camera size is absolutely just right for my hands. And while it's a little bit bigger than some of its competitors, it's around the same size as the Z8 and smaller than the Z9. For what this is designed to do, a hybrid camera with still photography capabilities and video capabilities, I find it really, really easy. It's got a little bit more chunky grip here. I personally really like that. And the ergonomics felt really, really right for me. The button placement, it's just solid. I really like everything about it. By the way, if you're an older Nikon shooter, they've moved the playback button over here to your primary hand, or your dominant hand in my case, and it works better for camera review, for picture review, image review. We call it chimping, but you can hit that button a little bit more easily. And then the delete button is going to be on the opposite side. And there's one other small button over here that's going to allow you to select your frame rate, doing all of that very quickly. So ergonomics feel good. It's kind of a traditional layout for Nikon, but I really, really liked the build. A couple other things I really liked about this in terms of the way it's structured. It's got a couple of screens. It's got an LCD screen here that's fully articulating and swings around to 180 degrees, so you can actually record yourself. If you're doing some self-recording, it's a really nice feature to have. Or if you're doing some vlogging, very nice feature to have for that. It's got a really nice EVF, or electronic viewfinder. They're considering this one best in class when it comes to resolution and brightness. So big wins on that one. A couple other things just on the side here. We've got an external charger. So there's a USB-C slot that will allow you to charge this continuously or just to resupply the battery. And it also allows you to move data out so you can download directly from the camera. I mentioned the overall layout is really good. Let's talk about these card slots. There's two card slots on this side. It's a CFB Express or XQD card plus an SD card. So two card slots, but different formats, with the faster one being that CF Express Type B. Now, internally, we're going to transition a little bit from the build on the outside to what's on the inside. That's really where it gets interesting. This is a 24 megapixel camera, and it's got a partially stacked sensor inside, and it's got their upgraded X-Speed 7 processor. We'll get into that a little bit because that really handles performance, but I'm going to list all of those features I just talked about as pros under the build category. Now, on the cons, there's a few things I will just say I don't really love. The battery door is one. This battery door is designed so that when it opens, it hits this triangle ring. I covered this in one of my other videos. I didn't really like that at all. You just move that triangle ring up and it's easier to get to. If you take it off, it's no big deal, but if you decide to keep that on for whatever reason, you're going to deal with that for a while. It only records to one of the slots inside. So it only records video to the faster of the cards. You can't do backup video while recording to the main card. Now you can do that with still images. So we're just talking about video for this, but you can't use that second card for that feature. The other thing I think I wish I liked, or I wish it had, in addition to some of these buttons on the back, I wish it included a button to quickly switch focus points. Now that's a feature that my Z9 has that this one didn't. So you do have to go into the menu or one of the back screen menus or touch menus, but you do have to access that from another function, or you can assign one of the two front function buttons to that. And after using this for a couple days, I quickly decided to change these function buttons so that one would allocate a separate focus point. So we can change the number of frames with a button on the back, but we can't change the actual type of focus points that it uses. So we've got to do that with a different function or go through the main menu. So a lot of good about the build, probably a strong attribute overall. A couple of minor things about this that I didn't love. I will also point out that the accessory port on the side, it's not really a pro or con, but it's got a push-in DC2 type connector. Now that's a connector that can actually pull in and push in. It's not screwed in. There's a threaded 10-pin connector that Nikon uses on their Pro bodies, and that one actually threads in, so it's harder to get off. So not really a pro or a con, just kind of a something to know. A battery on this one, we should point out, it's the smaller battery, the EN-EL15, and that battery does not have the same life as its bigger battery that Nikon uses. So in their Pro models, they use a bigger battery. This uses the smaller battery. I'm not going to list that as a con so much because it's just the size of the camera. That's what it's going to use. These smaller form factors will use that smaller battery. However, it does have the ability to add an adapter. So if you wanted to throw in a second battery, you would get a small hand grip at the bottom and you would put 2 batteries in that, and that would expand your battery life as well. So anyway, pros and cons for the build. I would say overall, really, really like the build, by the way. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the internals. I talked about that partially stacked sensor and the processing power and the 24 megapixels. When you put all that together, you've got fewer megapixels, which means less data to move in and out. You've got a partially stacked sensor, which improves read speed, and you've got a faster processor. And you put all that together and you get speed. It's really what this camera is designed to do, is move things quickly and give you extra frame rate and extra video resolution. So let's talk about some of these pros around performance. I'm going to list speed. I'm just going to say speed is probably its main pro, but that includes the frame rate. With still pictures, you're going to get 14 frames a second. With a mechanical shutter, you're going to get 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter, which can also be quiet. It's just about right for me. And I'm a wildlife photographer. I like frames per second. Rarely do I exceed 10 to 15, almost never more than 20. 20 is a lot of frames per second. If you've ever shot that many frames per second, you'll know that it's a lot of culling, a lot of data, and a lot of memory storage. There are instances where you may want more. So if you're thinking about split second, like really getting that timing, the classic example of a baseball hitter trying to hit the ball and getting the ball and the bat together, you may want to get even more frames than that, and we've got you covered here with 120 frames of JPEG. Now that 120 frames can also be used as pre-capture. Pre-capture is a feature that allows you to half press the shutter and it will buffer images until you push the shutter, and then it will actually go back in time and write those images to the memory card. So this is a camera that has that pre-capture, not a function I use a lot, even as a wildlife photographer, but there are moments where you've got to get that, for me, a bird taking off, for example, and you've waited and you've waited and you waited and you were a little late to press that trigger, but as long as you had it half pressed, those images will go back a few frames in time and you'll be able to write those to the card, and you've basically preserved an image that you couldn't have gotten otherwise. So pre-capture is a feature that this one has. And let's just talk, we talked about the frame rate, let's just talk about some of the other things that speed gets you. When you can process data faster, other things improve besides just the number of frames per second. You can also get better autofocusing. And you have to remember, these are just little miniature computers now. So the faster they can do things, the faster they can calculate things like where the autofocus should be. The autofocus on this is really, really solid. It includes some of the tracking features that the Z9 has, and Nikon calls that 3D tracking. This will allow you to lock onto a specific part, generally the eye of an animal or a human, and actually follow it as that person moves. So it's a really nice feature to have. I love it in my bird photography. I'm glad they included it here. So the autofocus overall, really, really good and much improved. And I have the Z6 II, and I'm going to tell you, it's much improved from the previous generation of the Z6 line. Now, is it perfect? Let's go over to the cons. The autofocus did not appear to hit perfectly or as perfectly as the Z9. It's not bad, but I'm going to guess, and it's very tough to test this, by the way. If you set up static subjects that aren't moving, it's never going to miss, and neither is the Z9. If you try to control an area with moving subjects, it's really hard to track those. Rather than do that, I went out into the field and just used it a lot. What it felt like, and I have to do this emotionally, I can't do this by just testing it. Emotionally, it felt like it wasn't quite as accurate as the Z9. And if I had to put a percentage on that, I'm going to throw out 10%. Meaning if the Z9 captured 7 out of 10 frames, this one got 6 out of 10. That is my best guess. I'm going to list it as a con, but I don't want to overemphasize this. It's a pro because it's way better than the Z6 II in my opinion. It could be a con because it didn't feel quite as accurate as the Z9. Now the Z9 has a fully stacked sensor, same processor. I'm guessing the partially stacked sensor maybe had something to do with that, or possibly just human error and the conditions weren't right on the days I was shooting and the autofocus just felt a little off. Now there's 2 other cons I want to mention with this. I mentioned the 24 megapixel sensor. I'm going to list that as a con, and I'm going to list it as a con because it's a little light. It's a little light for a lot of applications. Most people like more resolution. An experienced photographer will tell you that 24 megapixels will suffice for almost all applications. But people have gotten used to larger resolution. They've gotten used to shooting 45, even 60 megapixel cameras. And getting back to 24 seemed a little light. And it felt a little bit light, especially when I got back to the computer and I was editing and I was cropping or recomposing. And we do that a lot, especially as wildlife photographers. If you're not doing cropping, or if you're able to compose in camera, 24 megapixels isn't really going to be a big deal. And if you're not printing extremely large, those megapixels aren't going to matter. But I am going to list it as a con. To me, 30, 36 megapixels feels like a sweet spot for cameras. And I think that 24 is just a little light. But you also have to remember, what it's designed to be is that hybrid camera, and lowering the megapixels in the sensor, so having fewer megapixels to deal with, allows speed to increase because again, it's all data and we just don't have as much data moving in and out of the camera at 24 megapixels. One more thing that we need to talk about, and this is a big deal. I think I mentioned earlier that this was a dual gain sensor, and if I didn't, I apologize. That should be under the pro column for sure, but it is a dual gain sensor, and that's good. Dual gain means that it's got 2 conversion points, one for low gain conversion and one for high gain conversion. To put it simple, the high gain conversion point is going to give you better shadow detail. It's gonna perform better in shadows. Now, I did a video on dual gain sensor, so you might want to go check that out if you have no idea what this is and you're curious. But suffice to say, the dual gain point on this is 800 ISO. The dynamic range on this is listed at 10.5 stops or 10.5 EV. Most cameras, most of this camera's competitors, even older DSLRs will have a dynamic range between 12 and 14. So on paper, this seems a little light in dynamic range. The dynamic range seems a little narrower. Any photographer is going to want the widest dynamic range possible. It just means you can capture scenes that have these really bright areas and really dark areas, and the camera will be better able to replicate it. In this case, it's a little bit light there. And that's going to be listed as a con with an asterisk. And the asterisk is this: most people, in most situations, that dynamic range is going to be irrelevant because the scenes won't have more than 10.5 stops of this change in light to dark areas. Most cameras at 10 megapixels is fine. So 90–95% of the scenes you're going to shoot, that dynamic range isn't going to matter nearly as much. The other thing to consider is once we get to 800 ISO, once I've raised my ISO above the base, this camera is going to kick in that dual gain point and the dynamic range actually gets better. Now, what I mean by that is that you'll get a steady decline in dynamic range until you get to ISO 800, and then it'll actually boost back up. Testing shows this as having an EV of 9 stops. So 9 stops of dynamic range at ISO 800, at ISO 100, 10.5. It's significant on paper, and it might be a big deal to somebody like a landscape photographer who wants the widest dynamic range and who shoots at base ISO or very low, like 100 ISO. It may not matter if you're shooting in lower light conditions like I often shoot, and your ISO is going to be around 800 anyway. That dynamic range becomes almost irrelevant at that point because this is going to perform just as well as almost all of its competitors. So it's something to think about, but it really depends on your case usage. Like, what are you actually using this for, and what's the purpose of the camera? So two things here, that lower resolution and that dynamic range. I talked a lot about dynamic range because on this camera, that's the hit. Like, that's the big one. If you read anything and they tell you the negatives, that's always going to come up. But what they may not mention is that dynamic range also is a little subjective, meaning manufacturers put out a dynamic range, and until you actually test it, that dynamic range can be a little flawed. So I'm going to tell you the dynamic range on this. Practically, I had no problems with it. I didn't see it in any of the scenes I was shooting, but in fairness, I didn't take it out and test it in conditions where I had extremely bright areas and extremely dark areas. I had one image, I'm going to pull it up on the screen now. It is a hawk that I shot that was backlit by the sun. You can see there's a lot of shadows on the subject in the original, and the background is properly exposed. I shot this at a very low ISO. Even with this more limited dynamic range in post-processing, I was able to make it look like this. So, by the way, not an award-winning image, but it was the best image I had with this camera to show that example. So that's what I've got for you with pros and cons and performance. I'm going to segue out of that, get into video real quick because video is a big deal in this one. Now, I did a full review of the video capabilities of this. So if you want to get a deep dive, go over and check it out. But here's what I got for you. Resolution. I get up to 6K resolution with this one. Really, really nice feature. A lot of cameras in this price point will only go up to 4K. Frame rate. I get 240 frames a second in high definition. I get 120 frames a second in 4K. That is much better than most of its competition. So from a performance standpoint, we're feeling really, really good about where we're at. And then you add on available formats. I can shoot this in RAW, and I can process it internally. With some cameras, I would have to export that into an external recorder to get raw footage. I have N-Log available in this. Again, those concepts are covered in my videos around the video capabilities for this. And I also have a video on video basics, which kind of explains some of this. But what you're going to know, if you know anything about videography, shooting raw internals, really, really nice feature. N-Log is really, really nice. A little advanced, but they have several file formats available, including 8-bit, 10-bit, and 12-bit processing. What I'm going to tell you is it's a pro. There's a lot of advantages in terms of file formats and available formats for this camera. We're going to rank that one as a pro. And then it's also got a little bit longer recording time. So if you, for whatever reason, are recording for a longer period of time, this one will record up to 2 hours, and the other previous generations would only go about 30 minutes. On the cons side for video, there's not a whole lot here, but I want to mention two. One, it's not an 8K processor, or it's not an 8K resolution capable video camera. For most people, that's not going to matter. 8K is a lot. Most people don't even watch it in 8K, so for the vast majority of your viewing audience, however you're putting this out there, it's not going to matter. 8K could give you the opportunity to crop down your video quite a bit, but for me, 6K I found more than capable. I don't really think I'll need that 8K capability for what this camera is going to do, so I'll put it up there as a con. If you really, for some reason, think you must have an 8K camera, this isn't going to be the one. You may have to spend a little bit more money to get it, though. Autofocus. Autofocus was pretty tight, but it did breathe just a little bit in and out occasionally. I wouldn't say it was a real big deal, but I felt it a couple times. I tested myself vlogging. I tested some birds, and every now and then it would just seem to move a hair in and out, similar to what I saw in the still pictures. So every now and then it would just be like a frame or two would be out of focus, and then it would get right back in focus. Don't know how to explain that. I don't think it's all user error, though. So I'll list that as a con. And the last one, and if you read anything about the negatives for video on this one, what you're going to see likely is shadows and low light performance, meaning that in very dark scenes with a lot of shadows, there's actually an effect they're calling shadow flickering. and it just means you're going to get some distortion. It almost looks like visible noise and this slight flickering in the shadows. Now that is under extreme conditions. I noticed absolutely none of that when I tested this. And if you want to see those test videos, go check out my other videos and you'll see it. I didn't have any problem with that. For me, shooting in, average conditions with average light, overcast conditions, sun out, nothing mattered. The video quality I thought was actually very, very good in those conditions. So I'm going to list those as cons, but take it with a grain of salt. That low light performance is probably only going to affect you in very severe conditions or very, very low light conditions. I want to mention a couple other things before we wrap up and tell you who this one is for. There's a couple features it had, a couple features it didn't have. Pixel shift is a feature it has. Pixel shifting is really cool. I got a video on that one too that I did. This allows you to take a 24 megapixel image and make it 96. So you're going almost to 100 megapixels. It is a huge file that it produces, and it does it by taking the sensor and merging images that you're taking at the same time. Let me give you an example. You've got a still object, the camera's on a tripod. It's going to take 8, 16, 32 images, and then in a piece of software, it's going to merge them together. It's a free software program by Nikon. You just download the software. It merges those files together, and here's what you get. You have the opportunity to increase it to 96 megapixels, and it actually reduces the noise in the process. It's different than doing third-party software where you take an image and they would call this upsizing it or making it bigger. That's a software process. This, while it is a software process to merge the files, you're using the data from all of the images captured. So there's more actual data going into these files, and it produces a clean file that is really, really impressive. So Pixel Shift really, really liked that feature. One feature this one didn't have, and I actually looked a couple times in the menu and thought, man, I must have missed it. It doesn't have auto capture. Auto capture is a feature where it allows you to almost camera trap without any accessories. The sensor detects movement, it takes pictures or records videos based off of what you've told it to do, and it's really, really neat. So it doesn't have that feature, and it could be because of the battery. It does have a lot of drain on battery. So that's just a feature that's not in there right now. Could be a firmware update down the road, by the way, but it's not in there now. So that's what I've got. I'm going to list over here in big categories. If I had to list my big categories for pros: build, I got it as a pro; performance, especially around speed, I got that as a pro; video capabilities, I got that as a pro. On the cons side, not really much here, and I'm reluctant to put the word quality down. When I talk about quality, the problem is people think it's bad. The quality issues that I saw on this were pretty specific around that low light video performance. And again, it's in just really tough conditions. Possibly the autofocus wasn't as tight, but it's such a big improvement. I almost tell you autofocus is a win for this one. And then there were just some minor things that, the battery door, not having a button on here to switch focus points, little things like that. The single card recording, some little things in there. But I would say the biggest con for me probably could be that quality issue along with that smaller sensor size. So that's my list of pros and cons. I'm going to stick to it because I believe that list is accurate. If you got any comments on this, if you've ever used it, down in the comments, let me know if you think I got it right. If you have any questions about what I've covered so far, put them down in the comments. I read every comment. I try to answer every comment. But before I wrap the video, I want to tell you who this one is for. Now, I believe this can be your primary camera body in certain situations. If you're looking for a highly versatile camera, which takes very good still images, can do very good video, especially around the ability to slow it down, and maybe you're a content creator, this would be the perfect camera for somebody who is, and it's what I call this camera, the jack of all trades. A jack of all trades, maybe master of none, but everything it does very, very well. So if you're looking for versatility, I would absolutely encourage you to take a look at this camera. It could also be a primary camera for some genres. So street photography, I can see it as an application there. Event photography, I can certainly see an application for it there. And sports, because of that really fast frame rate and the ability to slow down the video, I could see an application for sports photographers to use this as well. In addition to that, it could be a great backup camera. Let me explain my situation. I'm a wildlife photographer. I shoot birds. I believe the Z9, certainly for Nikon, is the best available bird photography camera on the market. It might be better than Sony and Canon and Olympus. Don't try to sell me on Fujifilm for this. It could be the best on the market, period. But I need a backup camera. So I have two options here. I can go with another type of Z9, maybe a Z8 with a lot of resolution, very fast camera, wonderful cameras, both of them. Or I can go a little different direction. And that's what I'm probably going to do, actually. This is likely to be my backup camera. I don't own this one, but I'll order it. And the reason is because it's not what I have. I might want something as a backup camera that is actually different. Focus this camera on things like video. I can do general photography, no problem. If that one goes down, listen, I shot birds with this for 45 days. I didn't really have any issues with it. It wasn't as good as my Z9 for birds, but the drop-off isn't so significant that I can't use it. So I could absolutely use this as a second camera. And I think almost any photographer, especially if you have video applications, especially if you're doing some self-filming like I do, this could be a really, really strong option. So think about what your needs are, and think about if your second camera just wants to be a repeat of your first one, or do you want something that offers you that really versatile product? This hybrid camera could absolutely fill that niche. Now, the people it's not for, I think landscape photographers, this probably isn't going to be your camera, because you really are looking for more resolution, and dynamic range could be more important. And I told you that's one of the big knocks on this one, is that dynamic range. So landscape photographers as your primary camera, no. As a backup though, for the same reason I may back this up for my wildlife setups, could work. It could be a really nice option because of that video capability and some of the other things that it has. And then keep in mind that pixel shifting. You're a landscape photographer, your scene is static, you're on a tripod, take advantage of that pixel shift, and maybe you can end up with some really neat landscape images that this will outperform your high megapixel 45 or 60 megapixel camera. So that could be a really great option in some situations. Again, probably as a backup camera for wildlife and a backup camera for landscape, but could be a very capable backup, probably not your primary. And that's the video that I've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed this one. God, you know why I hope you enjoyed this one? I had to record it 4 times. I had technical errors. I forgot to plug in my mic. My camera was out of focus on one. I think I spent about 4 hours making this video today. So do me a favor. Just feel bad for me and hit the subscribe button, if nothing else, on this one. Hit the bell for notifications. I do have a really nice playlist about this camera. And don't worry, if you're not a wildlife photographer, I've got content for everybody. I do gear reviews. I do opinion pieces. I even gave a mini rant a couple times. So subscribe to the channel, check out the playlist, because I do a lot of different content on here. I think you'll find something that you enjoy. And lastly, I say it on every video, I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.